Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 4:05, May 28, 2020, and I call to order the special meeting of the Victorville City Council, Victorville Library Board of Trustees, Southern California Logistics Rail Authority, Southern California Logistics Airport Authority, successor agency to the Victorville Redevelopment Agency, Victorville Joint Powers Financing Authority, Victorville Water District, and the City Housing as a successor. May we have roll call, please?
Councilmember Cox,
Here.
Councilmember Gomez,
Present.
Councilmember Jones,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Ramirez,
Here.
Mayor Garcia.
Here. We will have the Pledge of Allegiance led by City Manager Keith Messler. So you please stand.
Oath of liberty and justice for all.
At this time, Madam Clerk, will you please present the agenda?
The City Council welcomes and encourages the public's participation and invites the community to attend. Anyone wishing to speak during public comment or on a particular item is requested to complete a speaker card and hand it to a sheriff's deputy prior to the public comment or before an agenda item is discussed. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes or less as deemed necessary by the mayor. All communications are to be addressed directly to the City Council, not to the members of the audience. Individuals should not approach the dais unless authorized by the presiding officer. In accordance with state law, the City Council may not take an action on any non-agenda items. The Council may receive testimony and set the matter to a subsequent meeting. Any person or group who interferes with the conduct of a City Council meeting by disrupting the meeting is subject to removal. The presiding officer may request a peace officer to assist with the removal should any person or group fail to comply with an order of removal. Any person or group who resists removal by a peace officer is subject to arrest and prosecution pursuant to Government Code Section 54957.9, Penal Code Section 403. Everything is before the council. We have no revisions to the agenda. You do have one public comment card.
Yes, there is. Kyle?
Good afternoon, City Council members. My name is Kyle Hovanesian. I'm a student who attends Victor Valley High School. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. In the past few years, students across this country have begun to step up and take action on political issues. Our democracy is in desperate need of reform. It is time that we begin to incorporate our youth in politics and let us have a say in our world too. Students are a vital component to society, yet we are missing from the discussion. Our education system is one meant for students, yet we are left out of that discussion as well. We have no say in how it is run. Our city has a great opportunity to become a leader in the fight for student suffrage by expanding our electorate to include the bright minds of our future. The city of Berkeley accomplished a great goal by voting to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote in their school board elections. I hope our city can join this movement and set a higher standard in how we view and treat students in the city. I'd like to propose an item line to be set aside for a memorandum of understanding to assist schools in the school board elections and show that our city has vested interest into the civic active engagement of 16 and 17-year-olds. Our city should invest more money into the civic engagement for this demographic and help bring youth into the fold. By spending more money on voter engagement in general, specifically towards young people, we will see an expanded electorate. In democracies, it is fundamental that people have the ability to vote and that representatives represent everyone. Young people are just not represented as of now, and we never will be until we have the right to vote. Research shows that this project would work to overall increase voter turnout in the short and long run, and it will strengthen a weakening civic culture in our society. Our city would do greatly to boost voter turnout and expand the right to vote, starting with school board elections. By divesting funds into the general goal of civic engagement for those under 18, the city will greatly improve in terms of the state of its democracy. As adults, it is up to you to choose to listen to the youth and what we have to say. You can join our movement and help give us a platform on which together we can accomplish great things. At the end of the day, the goal for young people and adults is to improve the lives of those around us. Thank you so much.
This evening, we have one agenda item. I'm
Yeah,
not,
Madam Mayor, could I clarify something, or maybe, so you're requesting to vote in the school board elections, but not anybody else, not anything else, just the school board? I'm all for it. School board.
I'm not sure how to read this, but anyhow, we have one agenda item this evening. The item is pre-budget workshop, establishing the annual budget for fiscal year 2020-2021. The recommendation is that any action is at the discretion of the city council. I will ask our city manager to present this item at this time, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council, and thank you also for providing us with this opportunity early in the process before we actually begin considering the eventual approval of the budget for our upcoming fiscal year, which is the 2020-21 fiscal year. And I should share with you from our perspective that this is first step in a process that can then lead into multiple meetings. But effectively, this is the first step in a process that establishes what we consider your spending plan for the upcoming fiscal year. And as we establish this ultimately as our spending plan, now I commonly refer to this as a document that we use to guide us through the year, not necessarily as a license to spend, but certainly as a plan to guide us through the fiscal year that requires constant monitoring throughout the year, monitoring of revenues to make sure they're coming in on track against, of course, the expenditures based upon the way activities are occurring, and constantly trying to balance those throughout the year. And occasionally we come back to you during a mid-year, for example, which we had just recently done this last February. And those would be times when, for example, we see changes during the fiscal year that require attention on the revenue expenditure side. One of the things that we've done for you today to try to make this presentation as easy as possible is we've got an agenda here for you that I think first is appropriate considering the emergency status that we're in, is to give you an overview of the impact of COVID-19, attending to that issue up front, because that does factor in obviously into what we're currently doing to close out this fiscal year, but certainly impacts our view on how we intend to operate in the upcoming fiscal year. And George Harris will lead that part of the presentation. But from there, we'll actually roll into, we'll take the deeper dive into the budget overview, studying, of course, revenues, expenditures on the general fund side, and then, of course, breaking things down to the various funds, the enterprise funds, the special funds that we operate. We will identify some of the more significant capital improvements that are supported by either those, by any of those funds. We'll also take a look at some of the personnel. The table of org actually is a document that comes back as a part of the budget, but the personnel recommendations that are in this presentation actually lead towards inclusion into that table of org, which is a part of the larger budget document. And then towards the end, we'll actually present to you a perspective that we call our forward look. Given the revenues and expenditures, what do we have to look forward to actually guide us through the year? And a large part of that is going to be sharing with you some of the economic development activity that we expect to occur in the upcoming fiscal year. But we also don't want to be blind to the challenges that we perhaps can foresee as well. So we'll share with that, and then we'll conclude in just talking through next steps. But most importantly, I would suggest to you that as we develop this document for you, this effectively is your opportunity as a city council to basically establish policy for the fiscal year. And once adopted, this effectively does become the policy that you set. So we're certainly anxious to get any feedback, any comments you have regarding what we've included in this budget. If you have differing priorities, we certainly want to know that. If you have differing goals, we want to hear that as well, because that would be the opportunity for us upon conclusion of this meeting to evaluate those priorities and attempt to include them in either a future budget workshop or into the actual budget document for approval by the council. Of course, once we get that feedback from you, your executive team then becomes responsible for leading the multitude of teams that comprise the city organization, and effectively we're charged with bringing that document back. I think most importantly, before we get into this document, this is not something that is done overnight, and this year this budget was particularly difficult to put together, and certainly not because of the fiscal issues that we'll talk to you about, but I think a lot of it has to do with all that we've been attending to, both in the form of dealing with the local emergency, and then of course ramping up to put this budget together. And what we have before you couldn't have been done without the amazing help that we have from our leadership team, which is outlined on the presentation board for you, which is largely your directors and officers. But then, of course, they've got support teams as well. And I say particularly difficult in this case. We actually started this budget process preparing for the 2021 fiscal year on February 25th, right after we approved the mid-year budget. And of course, as you know, it was about March 17th when we declared the local emergency, and we actually had to put on hold the budget preparation. We actually had to pump the brakes on our budget efforts and refocus our teams on the local emergency activities of the Emergency Operations Center. Effectively, we as city employees were serving in two roles: EOC administrators and also administrators for the city. So we had to pump the brakes on the budget and then restart finally not until April 27th. So it's been about a month that we've really been able to focus back on putting these numbers together before you, so that you have a document that we can ultimately approve before July 1st, which is the commencement. With that, I'm going to turn this presentation over briefly to Deputy City Manager Harris, who is going to share with us his perspective of the impact of COVID from a financial perspective.
Thank you, Keith. When we put the presentation together, I think it was thoughtful of us to tackle the elephant in the room in the first couple slides. And so as we are trying to wrap up the end of fiscal year 1920, which will probably see the largest impact of COVID-19 on the numbers, it was important for us to actually transition with that message of how we're going to finish this year considering COVID, and what impact is it going to have thereafter into the next year that for you in a couple of weeks for adoption. The major impact as we sit here today from as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is sales, retail sales. That's the largest single impact to the city of Victorville, is the effect that the lack of being able to go out and spend money the way that we've historically been able to has been altered. The way that we shop has been altered. Our access to social activities have been altered. Our ability to simply just go out and get ice cream with our family has been altered. So as a result, the city has actually seen some major impacts in regards to sales tax. So the chart before you now is if you look at the red line, is what we anticipated would happen regarding sales tax given no COVID. And so if you recall back in 2018, 19, did see a spike, an increase in sales tax. A lot of that was recovery for a change of administration at the state, where some of the sales tax receipts were expected to be received in 17, 18, but were not received until 18, 19. And so I was a bit speculative at that point to actually trust that those numbers would continue. But as we got through adoption for fiscal year 1920 and into mid-year 1920, it had revealed itself that true sales activity was really increasing. And then come March, COVID-19 hits, and we see some substantial reductions in those original expectations that were delivered to the council and presented as part of the mid-year budget for 1920. So where we lie now on the chart is the blue line. So we spiked in 2018-19. We had anticipated steady income going into 1920, and that took an immediate, just in looking at the fourth quarter, what's expected and projected from the fourth quarter based on the type of activity we saw in the third quarter, is an immediate 15% reduction in our total number that was expected for the year, to the tune of $3.1 million less than what we had anticipated. Going into fiscal year 2021, our consultant HDL is only anticipating a small recovery. We, among ourselves, think that the recovery is maybe better than that, but at this time, until we know more, all we have really is to rely upon the HDL consultants review, which actually will look at individual sectors and how they have performed, and in other similar situations, which is hard for anyone to say now that they are making recommendations based on other similar situations, because to me this is the first I've ever seen of its kind, and hitting sales taxes the way it did. But we're at this point, numbers that you have before you regarding sales tax is highly dependent upon our consultant HDL and the adjustments that they have made. Keith, next slide. So in looking at the sectors that they believe are going to be highly impacted, and are those sectors that we, as we are now looking at the activity before us, as we're going throughout our day. I think somebody posted on Facebook the other day that they got 3 weeks to the gallon on their car, right? So they're not leaving the house. They're not going out and doing those things. So one of the sectors that are highly impacted is fuel and service stations. They expected to see a 32% reduction in fuel and service stations. Starting at the top, autos and transportation. That's sales as well as service, parts and so forth. Rentals, those are all in that same sector. General consumer goods, you could buy all the toilet paper in the world, but you're not going to make up for that loss in total sales that we're experiencing in the general consumer goods category. Restaurants and hotels, speculating from HDL gives us that reduction in total hotel activity, but in also talking to our local hotel owners, they are predicting that this last quarter, starting in April 1 going through June 30, that they're also expecting to see about a 30 to 40% reduction in their activity. Now, that seems bad, but I think we're not Anaheim. Right? Anaheim, whose almost their entire hotel TOT production is coming from tourism, which have taken in some of those areas 80 to 90% drops total production. So I think although 36% drop in our hotel and activity is large for us, it could be significantly worse if we are one of those areas that are highly dependent upon that the resort type of hotel stays and tourism aspect of it. Building and construction has also gone down, although we do still see permits being pulled and activity out there. This is the sales tax portion of the building and construction. So this is the Home Depots, this is the Lowe's. These are those categories of folks that are going out and buying those things. They just are, quite frankly, just not getting out of the house and going and doing it. And then business and industry for an overall reduction to the total sales tax of that 15% that we talked about. They do HDL being they are also only predicting about another 1.5% drop going into July. A lot of the speculation and analysis now is being based on a recovery that's going to start to begin in July. So come July 1, as you start seeing some of these sectors that we're talking about, these very sectors that we're talking about are beginning to open again. I can actually now go get a haircut. Barbershops are open again. So I myself am going to go and take advantage of that. But just say barbershops are opening. I myself we're gonna go take advantage of that, and so you can start seeing these sectors start to open again, and once we start getting to the level 3 of reopening, you're going to start to see some of these numbers start to improve. But what you're going to see are those sectors improving going into July 1st. So they're not predicting any further drop to the significant levels that we experienced in the current year. They're only looking at modest drops going into the next fiscal year, which is difficult for us to still grasp because we're not seeing the full recovery of what this loss that we incurred in the end of the year. It'll probably take a few years for us to truly recover to what I think that to the point that we were headed at the point that we made the presentation to you.
Through this pandemic, I realized that a lot of people stayed home, but realized that this is the first time ever that to go to a home-based close, the parking lot was totally full. You had to wait. They say inside the stores they have exceeded all sales, broken all records. Costco's exceeded all sales, broken all records. I realized that it's a total unknown because the mall is closed, so yeah, that took away. But I don't know how you evaluate that, but far greater than what staff is projecting.
And that's where those are some of the questions that we asked ourselves. In those categories, for every Costco, you have a Macy's, Penny, and other stores that weren't open at all, or they were doing online sales, or they were doing curbside sales, which dropped. So we are very thankful that the Costco's of the world and the Home Depots of the world actually boomed during this time, but we really needed their sales to boost to mitigate against the losses that we had on those other apparel type mall stores that were not allowed to be opening. So it's that balancing act that we're glad and we're fortunate. Yeah, they're doing very, very well. They have, and like I said, who knew that they can make so much money on toilet paper? But but they did, and they did well. But they're also offsetting major losses in stores that could not even open. This is once again, this is a sales tax analysis that's that we have that produced it. But after the first quarter, after this next quarter, we'll be able to actually see some real numbers. When you get into July, August, you'll actually see that once again, these were all projections based on kind of a worst case, very conservative worst case. So we will know more once we get into the truly happening.
Mayor Garcia, I'm not sure of the process, if it's going to be a conversational type. If you would let me know, because I have questions, but I don't know if it's going to be conversational or we're limited.
We'll be limited. We will call on you to speak.
Okay.
Additional areas of concern. We've already talked about the TOT tax, and that is a number that we've once I said before, we've actually gotten from the hotel owners. They are actually predicting that type of reduction in the fourth quarter. In talking to our building staff, they anticipated about a 20% reduction on just general counter activity. That's just building permits, inspections, and so forth. Business license is expecting the same, but mostly as a result of the businesses themselves having issues. They're expecting a 20% or a planned in this document to have a 20% reduction in what they would normally expect. On the property tax side, there really truly isn't an impact that we can predict, and that's more of an actual nationwide and statewide analysis that's being conducted, that property tax will not be impacted in the short term. We hope that what we have planned for property tax revenues would stay true. Investment earnings are impacted just because interest rates have fallen to zero, virtually fallen to zero. So the money that we do have invested is going to be significantly, or the investment earnings that we earn on the money we have invested is going to be significantly lower just as a result of the interest rate risk. And then anything tied to sales and fuel activity, as we talked about, getting 3 weeks to the gallon on your fuel tank, those are all going to be impacted. So that speaks directly to our Measure I activity as well as our. And then as the new normal, as far as how we interact with the community changes, we expect to see some reductions from a revenue side, as well as the cost for those recreation and community services programs that we offer. Community service. So what are the services impacted? And so far we've actually seen closures in the library. We think the new normal, and I don't want to keep calling it that because it seems stigma to it, because eventually I truly believe we would get out of this. But immediately when we look at the first quarter of the next fiscal year, you're looking at some adjustments being needed to be made for the way we provide community service and recreational programming, park activity reduction due to the social distancing restrictions, telecommuting time off or distance restrictions. Although we've reversed a lot of those and have brought a lot of people back to work, we still have some concerns. There are some employees that have concerns over possible exposure. So having to adjust request is going to somewhat change the way we do business. And then increased costs related to the emergency response. So PPE is still of a concern, making sure we have enough of that on hand for the field staff. Any changes that we have to make to this facility, as you see, we've had to even just change the way people enter the room tonight. So those types of changes will need to be made. Restricted service in City Hall. Once again, that's just another extension of the increased costs related to the emergency response. And really what this did give us a chance to do is kind of really test our ability to provide many more services online for the residents. And this may create even more of a demand on those resources to continue to offer services, but doing so they don't necessarily need to be present. One last thing before we leave this particular slide is, as we talked about interest earnings, is what effect that potentially could have on CalPERS. And so the good news is CalPERS takes 2 years to catch up. So any investment losses that we would incur, we being all the cities invested in CalPERS, would incur in the current year, they would aggregate those gains and losses for this particular fiscal year through June 30, and then they're going to rerun an actuarial in this year, and any rate adjustments necessary to react to any losses that we actually incurred this year will take place in actual 2 fiscal years from now. So the good news is we'll know exactly what those losses were as we complete this year, and most cities will have the ability to adapt and and plan for those adjustments. That's the good news. An additional good element of good news is if the returns are better next year, those returns could actually offset in the subsequent year any losses that we had this year. So it can start to work itself out, but it's a 2-year wait before those actuarials are actually performed and the actual adjustments to our liabilities are made to a point where it actually affects what we actually have to pay on an annual basis. With that, I'll turn it back to Keith, but in essence, that is what we predict and what our analysis has shown us is to be the impact of COVID-19 on the city's financials.
Thank you, George. In every budget, as we move into it, we do projections, we do forecasting, and we make a number of assumptions. And we did no different in this fiscal year, and we kind of laid out for you to review some of those that we considered. We have some others throughout the presentation that we'll highlight, especially as we get more specific to the particular enterprise funds or special funds. But as George kind of touched on it, a big part of this budget assumes certain levels of revenue impacts. And while you'll see in later slides the general fund, for example, in the aggregate will increase in revenue by 2%, that's after we've seen the biggest of the impact, which is currently happening right now in this fiscal year and is expected to duration of this fiscal year. So there is some small expected increase in revenue projected over the next fiscal year, but that's after that's an increase on top of the 15% we're effectively downwardly adjusting in the current fiscal year. George had talked about operational changes and staffing changes, especially as it may relate to seasonal type activities. Parks and Rec comes to mind. But I think an important assumption that we have included into this budget is that there's no planned COVID-19 related staffing reductions or furloughs in this budget, despite what you likely are hearing and seeing in other communities. There are other communities out there, because of the nature of how their revenues are structured, perhaps they're much more dependent upon, say, tourist type revenue. We're not expecting to be hit the same way as they are, but we're also, a major budget assumption is that go forward budget, we also rely on the use of our reserve funds to help us navigate through at least this fiscal year. And we've been fortunate, and you'll see some slides later in the presentation that speak to the general fund reserve. And ironically, in February, right before all of this happened, we were actually very excited, very pleased to be presenting the mid-year budget to you, because we had achieved approximately 19% general fund reserve amount over your budgeted expenditures, which exceeded, actually was the first time since we've had a reserve target, the first time we've actually been able to report meeting that, and we actually achieved it. And then 1 month later, we're internally talking about making downward adjustments because the COVID pandemic hit us, the world started to slow and stop, and with that, of course, we could not ignore the likelihood of revenue reductions because of that. So we do have a strong dependency upon what I call the rainy day fund. I've said it before that the general fund effectively should serve as a rainy day fund, and this budget looks at life as if it's raining now. One thing that we also did look at, and had we not dealt with the pandemic, resulting from the success we've had over the past few years in terms of our fiscal position improvement, after we had reported to you February at the mid-year, I had strongly been considering benefit enhancements to the employees. Currently, it's measured that the cost of living increase from March to March for our MSA, which is the metropolitan area, that is approximately 2.3%. I'd also considered it strongly an attempt to do a benefit enhancement to the allowance received by the employees to offset their cost for health benefits. Both of those valued at about $2.3 million, and this budget assumes foregoing that recommendation that had COVID not occurred, I'd likely be before you tonight recommending some necessary benefit enhancements to that is being foregone in this budget, hoping that it can be reevaluated if This next slide is a similar format to something you saw last year, and what it's intending to do is represent the aggregate budget. So what we have before you currently and it's in the budget binder that we've handed out. I believe we handed it out on Friday or Saturday to you. But that budget binder that you have represents a spending plan currently valued at a $224.8 million revenue generation. It also has an expenditure plan of $229.5 million, with an unencumbered fund balance dependency of about $4.7 million. And we typically know unencumbered fund balance is effectively drawing from cash available to basically offset the deficit spend that is occurring in the aggregate in this particular case. This is not your general fund. This is actually all 81 funds that represent the city's finances and accounting. It's a chart of accounts. And so with that, I always refer to those 81 funds as 81 business units or or even small business units that are under the umbrella of the city operation. So it's not that number, the 229 million, that is discretionary spending ability for things such as public safety. This is everything, including your water operations, your airport operations, your electric utility operations, everything included, and we'll break that down a little bit further. But I should point out that the $4.7 million deficit that you see for this current fiscal year, of that $4.7 million, 2.4 is represented as a need by the general fund, relying on its general fund reserve to help balance the general fund budget. The bottom half of this slide, you've seen something similar, and in what you've seen similar is what the current fiscal year adopted budget looked like. So in that first column that's entitled Adopted Budget, where you have a $215.5 million revenue against a $217.5 million expense, that's effectively the numbers that you should be familiar with that we actually approved last June. So this time last year we were effectively looking at those numbers. In February of this year, we brought back those numbers in the middle column that says mid-year amendment, which is the $220.5 million on the revenue side against $254.2 million on the expense. Again, relying on reserve funds, most likely from capital-related improvements taken on by respective funds. But one of the things that we added to this that's different than the comparable slide that we showed you this time last year is we actually put an amended budget column in there. And one of the things that we did internally, because we believed it was absolutely necessary to not ignore the immediate effects of the business closures from COVID-19, we made internal downward adjustments to make sure that had controls in place to not spend to the February mid-year amended budget. And we believe that was a responsible decision because the projections and estimates coming forward as to revenue declines, we needed to make some immediate downward adjustments on the expense side. So saying it differently, we altered the controls in the budgeting software that we have to make sure and protect against department spending to the February level. So we made downward adjustments in the system to control and basically account for what we were seeing as serious revenue declines due to COVID. So we internally amended the system to have those downward adjustments, which is $216 million on the revenue side against $247 on the expense side. This next slide is intended to take those same numbers that we're proposing for this upcoming fiscal year, the $224.8 million in revenue in the aggregate versus the $229.5 million in the expenditure side, and it's actually intended to kind of break down on the revenue side where those revenues are generated. And you'll see probably the two biggest components of the pie on the left side of this chart, to where 45% is identified for charges and services. We'll dive deeper into those charges for services when we get into some of the enterprises, but examples would be your charges through rates from whether it's the water district or the electric district or trash fees we collect. That's largely what comprises that charges for services. As you can see, that's a much greater number than the taxes, which are the property taxes and sales taxes. And then on the right side, breaking it down by category, I think an important part of this breakdown shows you operations and personnel. And while there's always a constant comment towards reducing salaries to help budget or cut staffing positions to help the budget, interestingly, there's a dynamic here worth noting that the operations and maintenance component of our aggregate operation here is about 45% against what is only 22% So effectively, the way I see this expenditure category breakdown on the expense side is that it takes 22% of the aggregate budget to actually administer the larger operations and maintenance. One more pie chart here for you, and this is actually intended to show again in the aggregate, same numbers, 225 million, 229.5 million. And this is to show it by fund type. So we're familiar with the general fund as being considered the discretionary fund of the city. That is the fund that you have absolute discretion over. This council sets the policy, and typically what this is funding largely is your public safety program. But the other funds, whether it's enterprise funds or special funds, special fund is a fund. It's an operation where the revenues collected for that particular special revenue have to be spent specific special purpose. Whereas enterprise funds, the best comparison again is the water district, where you have a water operation, where you have basically a water business, and those funds that are generated for that operation have to be spent a little bit more flexibly, but they do have to be spent to benefit the water operation. We've showed a slide similar to this previously. In fact, in the prior two fiscal year presentations, we've shared with you a simple perspective of your revenue and expenditures for the upcoming fiscal year. So your general fund revenue is measured at $63.9 million, and it's measured against expenditures of $67.3 million. We do have a balance sheet adjustment that occurs to actually enhance for about 4 more years after this fiscal year, George. And you'll remember we memorialized a loan relationship with VMIS a couple of years ago, where we were able to recognize startup costs to the order of about almost $18 million, and we actually booked that as a loan from the general fund to the Victorville utility as costs incurred by the general funds over many years that we identified should be repaid back. And so we memorialized that a couple years ago, right around the same time we were starting up the Victorville Fire Department. But we also had a repayment program where there was a large down payment, and then there were going to be annual payments of $1 million over the course of future years. And so what that actually helps in a case like this, because absent that loan repayment, your deficit would actually be greater. But right now we're projecting a deficit spend on the general fund that is going to rely on your general fund reserve to bridge this gap of the $2.4 million number. It's important for me to highlight that of the $2.4 million deficit, $1.9 million alone, which is the largest share of that 2.4, $1.9 million is directly attributed to the cost increase associated with the sheriff contract that we rely on to provide the very valuable and essential public safety policing services. And that's actually an increase derived by 2 components. There has been a full year's realization of a second lieutenant to help better manage the police force in Victorville. We have a pretty large operation, so we actually supported a leadership structure to where the chief is able to rely on 2 lieutenants, one to manage the admin side of the house and one to manage the operations side of the house. But also, as you know, and we shared it with you last August, the sheriff successfully negotiated with the county. The sheriff's union successfully negotiated, and it was well deserved, with the county a 5-year memorandum of understanding, basically locking in what amounts to almost 5 to 6% annually over the next 5 years of merit increases. Those effectively get passed on to the contracting agencies, and I highlight it not as a bad thing in this particular case. It's more an issue that we need to figure out how to address going forward, because now we're in the second, this budget year will represent the second year of that 5-year contract. And that contract is going to continue to go up. I believe my last analysis was aggregate it should by year 5 get to the order of about $34-35 million. So there's definitely a need just to maintain existing policing service levels. There's a need to really address the elephant in the room in this particular case, which is revenue source to keep at least your public safety levels. This next slide is intended to break down a little bit more how your general fund revenue is generated, and it's intended to summarize what we can characterize as your top 6. And so of your top 6, you can really kind of see where the bulk of the budget is, and if there's an effect on the top 6, that's generally going to be an effect on your aggregate general fund. But as you can see, the top 6 for this budget year comprises $57.3 million of the $63.9 million general fund budget. That's 90% of your general fund is by these top 6 categories. And I probably should just highlight, I think, the obvious that we focus on a lot, which is property tax and sales tax. I want you to remember the 60%. This next pie chart intends to share similarly on the opposite side your general fund expenditures by department. And I asked you to remember that 60% number. If you look at police and fire alone, fire is approximately 62%, slightly down from the current fiscal year, but that number will continue to increase as we have known costs related to the public safety contract with the county. This chart is intended to illustrate, and we talked about that $2.43 million dependency upon the general fund reserve. And in this chart, as you can see, from 2017 to 2019, we had some sharp increases in our deposit of surplus general fund revenue. Real spike, pleasant surprise, a spike to a $12.8 million deposit into your general fund reserve. And that actually measures against, at the time, what was a reserve policy requirement of $10.18 million. So you can clearly see a difference. That's about $2.8 million in excess reserve. Slightly growing again this fiscal year, and you might wonder why or how that actually increases this fiscal year. A large part of that has to do with the fact that VMIS loan is coming to supplement some of those losses. The losses, as you saw them, the 3.1 that George had shared earlier, a lot of that was actually offset. If you'll remember, at the mid-year budget, we actually made budget increase to the revenue side of sales tax. So effectively what we were losing was all of what we were projecting as sales tax increase at mid-year, plus a little bit more, but effectively being offset by the $1 million payment from VMIS. But as you can clearly see from this, what's projected through this fiscal year is a reduction in the general fund reserve. That's the 2.4 that's necessary to balance the budget to maintain existing service levels. And I should finally point out, notwithstanding that dramatic dip in general fund reserve balance, that 10.7 as we project it actually matches against what we're currently proposing as a general fund reserve policy amount of 10.1. So notwithstanding the deficit spend this year and the dependency on the general fund reserve, this budget projects that we'll still slightly exceed our 15% reserve target. So now I'm going to roll right into the enterprises and special funds. First one, is the water fund, and in your book, and I'm sorry, Dr. Ramirez, we're actually into the presentation. I probably should have called the page numbers out so that you could follow along. But on page 20 of the presentation that we emailed you a little bit earlier today, that's where we're at in the presentation document. But on page 20, we're talking about the water funds, which is in the book, the binder.
Yes. Well, I was trying to follow, and I had questions that I wanted to know specifically as George was talking, because to me, what page are they referring to right now? Okay, because I've been looking at the expenditures versus the revenue, and I had questions about that in terms of regarding to the debt versus the reserve. Okay, so we're on page 10 on the summary? Yeah, okay. Okay, so I have it now. Well, can we ask questions? Not yet? Okay.
So Dr. Rita, for your benefit, and I'm sorry I haven't done this, but I will read out the page number as I click through the presentation so that you can follow along better. But on page 20 of the presentation, we've got the water fund, which has traditionally been one of the healthier funds that we manage as the Water District Board of Directors. And so on page 20, what that slide is showing is for the aggregate of funds 410, 411, 412, and 413, in that aggregate, you're showing revenues to the order of $46.7 million against an expenditure side of $47.5 million, which proposes a deficit spend. That deficit spend is largely due to capital, and this again is another spendy capital year, and so effectively you'll rely on available resources, basically unencumbered fund balance to make up that deficit spend. But it's not uncommon in enterprises that we administer, especially that are supported by an actual rate plan, where you have ebbs and flows, where you have deficit years and surplus years, all supported by rates. And in this particular case, we are actually in this. We're actually in, I believe, the last year of our 5-year rate plan. We're actually completing the capital plan to support a rate plan, and we're actually going to be finishing a new rate plan for the next 5 years. And what this budget does is it does assume an additional rate increase for water in the order of 6.25%. That's supported by an already adopted rate plan by this council several years ago. And with that, that rate plan supports not only the operations and the expenditures and the capital, but it also factors in maintaining a number of reserve requirements, including operating reserve requirements, capital reserve requirements, debt service reserve requirements, and so with that, and I should say the OPEBs, which are the pension. So with that, it's a healthy fund, notwithstanding the deficit spend. This actual fund contemplates these kinds of capital we'll talk about in later in the presentation. On page 21 of the presentation, that's your sanitation fund. In the book, in the binder that you have, that would correspond to Fund 425. And this is basically the sewer operations. And in Fund 425, there's really two functions that are occurring. There's a collection operation, which is basically the piping system that are in our rights of way, that actually collect all of the sewage, whether it's from commercial users, residential, or industrial users. So there's a collection component within this fund, and there's also a collection for what we call the treatment component, whether it's from the regional treatment facility, which is VVWA. They charge us a rate. We effectively pass that rate through as a part of our rate plan, and or our wastewater treatment plant out at SCLA that does treat flows from the Victorville community. But this budget does contemplate a rate-supported rate increase of 11.2%. That rate plan was shared with this council, I believe, back in February as we amended it to address VVWA's adopted rate increases of last December, recapping what we did in February when we adopted our new rate plan for our sewer system. We effectively chose to forego having to come back to this council twice, once in this current fiscal year and then once to deal with the next fiscal year. And so we effectively bundled up all of the rate increase that would have occurred over the course of January through June of this calendar year, lumped it in, and basically stretched it out over the remaining 4.5 years for the rate plan. So effectively what this is representing is a rate plan increase of 7.5 for Victorville's collection system, and the rate increase component from VVWA is about 3.62% for that total aggregate rate increase value of 11.2. That's showing you a revenue of $15 million. This is a very capital intensive year. Probably the biggest project that's actually proposed in this fiscal year is going to probably start on Monday, is what I'm told. Where mobilization, if it hasn't already started, it's going to be out there Monday. It's going to actually look like we're building the Green Tree extension. We're not yet breaking ground on the Green Tree extension, but you'll actually see that giant hill that Green Tree T intersects with Hesperia Road. That hill right behind that T intersection will actually start the earthwork process, and some of that hill will be coming down, more so related to a sewer project that we've approved that basically improves the capacity in that sewer line, where we have two lines meeting up in Hesperia Road that eventually discharge to the regional interceptor. So this year, as planned for in our rate plan, is a capital intensive deficit spend. The next page, Dr. Rita, is page 22, and we're speaking now to the solid waste fund, trash fund, it's recycling fund, funds 427, and it's important to note as well that these funds are actually rate supported as well. We've done a rate plan to support what's in this budget, which is an proposed increase to the trash rates of 2.8%. And effectively, we're in year 3 of a 5-year rate plan. And what I want to show you is you've got $18.6 million in revenues being measured against $18.3 million of expenditures, so there's a slight little surplus at the end. But you'll see an asterisk at the available resources of 4.1, almost $4.2 million. And I think more than anything, what I want to demonstrate to you here is while we're in year 3 of year 5, I can remember speaking to you in early 2018, and it was one of my biggest worries when I was first starting out as the city manager, is in looking at this fund in January and February of 2018. I remember very distinctly, because this fund had not has not done a rate plan. I believe in this case it was 10 years. Don't quote me on that. But I can remember distinctly that we were staring at a potential to actually literally run out of cash in this fund by September of 2018 had we not put the rate plan in place. So thankfully we did do that in that fiscal year, and I think my point in all of that is that rate plan has actually helped support get this fund back to what I would consider a healthier status. Street lighting fund is Fund 220, and similarly you'll see revenues revenues to the order of $1.8 million measured against expenditures of $2.4 million. We've heard the message of council from many years ago, probably 2-3 years now, to where this fund actually was generating quite a bit of surplus revenue and not doing enough with it. Quite honestly, was being spent on operations and expenses and neglecting capital needs. And so we've actually been using this fund to expand our street lighting system. So you've actually seen an intentional draw from a policy perspective from this council, a draw on available resources and actually spending that on capital. We've had a number of successes over the years, but I think it's probably most important to note that in this current fiscal year, just in the square mile alone, we added 50 new street lights at very dark intersections. In Old Town, we've added 30 street lights to fill in the gaps, particularly at the alleyways, because that was a policy directive of this council. We've seen a new traffic signal at La Mesa and Nisqually. I'm sorry, not La Mesa and Nisqually. Mesa and US 395. And we're expecting, and we're not done with Old Town, I should say. SCE is still actively designing new street lights for 7th Street for a stretch between Forest and D Street, so we're hopeful that that's something forthcoming in this fiscal year. We are expecting 2 new traffic signal projects, one at Mariposa and Yates, and you'll remember having heard for quite some time some concern about that T intersection at Mariposa. So we've got a traffic signal proposed there, along with another one at Mojave and Condor. We're making some meaningful progress in actually spending down those funds, improving our street lighting system throughout. And page 24 is our storm drain fund. We call it Fund 202. And this is one of our more difficult funds. This is largely operations expense with very little room, very little ability to spend on capital. And this is the very small fee that you'll see on your water bill. We call it our water bill, but it's not all water. But on there is a line item for storm drain, and this is effectively the $4 that we generate per parcel. And so we are in a deficit spend situation. We're depleting the available resources, which makes it very difficult with this type of money to attend to preventative maintenance items such as what we had been discussing over the course of the last couple meetings in the emergency that we've been dealing with at Amethyst and Nisqually. This is something that staff has its eyes on, and we are looking at capital needs citywide. We do envision coming back to you at a point in time in the future with recommendations that we do something to address storm drain in terms of some kind of funding enhancement, but we don't have that for you right now. The Southern California Logistics Airport, page 25, Dr. Rita, of the presentation. And so you've got a $32 million operation there. A lot of it is debt against an expenditure side of $31 million with a surplus, operating surplus of 1.279. And one of the things that I want to point out is I think the two measures, I should say, that kind of give me a little bit of excitement about what's happening on the airport itself is when you look at the airport operations revenue number of 9.6, almost 9.7, and you measure that against the airport operations of 7.9 expenditures. So just between those two numbers, you've got approximately 1.7 in net revenue from airport operations, and that's what I would focus on to measure the health of what's going on inside the fence, let's call it. So that's your airport operations, that's your lease. On the revenue side, your biggest contributors to the revenue side are going to be lease revenues. So that's leasing your hangars, that's drawing from your parking areas, that's ground leasing property to users. Our lease revenues contribute to about 80% of the total revenue makeup of the airport, and basically this showing you that your revenues are up, they're strong to where we've actually maintained and kept quite well. Nice revenue pops, as I would call them, and we'll talk about them later in the presentation, have a lot to do with just the increased dependency that the world has had on SCLA during this COVID pandemic, with all of the parked somewhere. In fact, so many that we actually closed one of our 2 runways just to create parking space for aircraft. But of course, your biggest tenants out there are helping support as well, which are Boeing and General Electric and ComAv. Another of the enterprises in Dr. Rita, this is on page 26 of the presentation, which is the Victorville Municipal.
Excuse me, I heard my name, but I didn't hear the rest of it.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Rita, we're on page 26 of the PowerPoint presentation, which is a slide that describes the revenue expenditures for the Victorville Municipal Utility Services, which in our accounting system is funds 419 through 420. And what this is showing you is an aggregate revenue generation of $17.4 million against an expenditure side of $16.5 million, with a slight surplus, almost $1 million, $932,000. And then what we did, because the utility service, which I know you know, but maybe for the benefit of the public, VMUS operates an electric system and a natural gas system. The natural gas system is at SCLA. We operate 2 electrical systems, one at SCLA and one at the Foxborough Industrial Park. So, and our customer base is strictly commercial industrial users, no residential support for these utility operations. But effectively, you're showing some fairly healthy resources available considering the size of those operations. Dr. Rita, we're jumping forward to page 28 of the presentation, which is going to start.
I'm sorry, but I don't hear the last couple of words you keep saying.
So, Dr. Rita, we're on page.
Where are you right now?
Dr. Rita, we're on page 28 of the presentation. The top of the slide is entitled CIP Projects.
Okay, that's fine. I've already read all that. Okay, that's fine.
So among the CIP projects that we have here, and we've summarized what we think are the most meaningful. Of course, the actual budget binder that you have will detail even better. And to the extent you have any real detailed questions about these, the leadership team is on the line as well. And to the extent you have questions about these, we can ask. If I can't answer them, we'll certainly bring on the heavier hitters to be able to answer on these. But as you can see, the airport has a fairly meaningful CIP project in Building 676. This is it's been needed for quite some time, and I think we finally got to the end of our rope with Building 676. You may not know which Building 676 is unless I told you that it was the 1950s vintage wide-body hangar out at SCLA. The current tenant of that hangar is Boeing. It's one of the 2 large hangars that Boeing rents, and we've just done enough band-aid fixes of this facility to where it's time to really address properly the re-roofing of that hangar. The winds just effectively have been way too unkind to that facility over the years, so it needs a little additional TLC. Got some park lighting upgrades in our parks facilities. To give you some perspective, and just for the benefit of the public, I'll go back to the airport and identify the funding sources, because I think it's important to know where these are being funded from, so that there isn't an impression that all of these are being funded from the general fund. The general fund is fairly constrained with other items. But the airport, obviously, that would be coming from the airport operations on airport funds. Parks and Rec, for example, that likely is from the general fund. In the sewer, and we shared with you a fairly big capital improvement spend this year, and you can see some of those items, including a large sewer capacity project on Nisqually Road. And I believe that number is small, at least it looks small to me, because it looks like there's a lesser amount being carried forward of the aggregate amount of the project, meaning there's going to be spent this fiscal year and booked to this fiscal year. Interestingly, and I call out one project because we'll be working to market it heavily as a part of our settlement with Lahontan. We were authorized as a part of the settlement to work on a project here that's called the Old Town Septic to Sewer Conversion. And for the ultimate goal and purpose of trying to reduce the risk to groundwater with nitrates, we will actively be marketing this program to residents, particularly in the Old Town area, where our goal is to start converting those that are on septic systems and converting them actually to making direct connection into the sewer system. So that amount will be used for that particular reason. Then you've got some sewer mainlining projects which were identified resulting from having invested in the camera surveying of our entire system. And then you'll see the IWWTP, and then you got some interesting letters. Those letters are basically abbreviations for a magnesium hydroxide storage and feeding system, and that's a supplement to the wastewater treatment plant out at the airport, which mag hydroxide is likely used in this case to help balance any spikes in total dissolved solids, one of the constituencies that we typically have issue with when you have a high sugar user that's contributing to the discharge to that plant. Continuing on, we've got a number of water pipeline improvements throughout the city. In some cases, this is replacing old steel pipe to new plastic. We're going to continue to invest in our advanced metering infrastructure. And pump to waste, we actually just recently approved a couple of those. We're trying to do 2 pump to waste projects a year, so we're planning on doing a few. And then of course the McCart re-roofing project, that likely would be a general funded Dr. Reader, we're on page 30, capital improvement projects still, and now we're talking about streets. And so probably the most notable on this particular page is the amount that's actually programmed in there for the Green Tree extension. One item that this council will see at the June 16th council meeting, at least that was my last understood plan, was the June 16th council meeting to have for your consideration the approval of a construction management agreement. The construction management agreement would be used to retain a firm to basically manage, first determine the constructability and then manage the actual construction of the project. Our current timeline is probably second quarter. Don't quote me, but our current plan is about the second quarter of 2021 calendar year to actually start the construction of that project. So that $13 million represents our share to be matched against shares that we will then get from the County of San Bernardino, the Town of Apple Valley, along with County Transportation Commission, the CTC. Some other major equipment purchases, and these track back to the actual enterprises or the funds that we had previously talked about. There's a new apparatus required for the aircraft rescue and firefighting out at the airport. That would be airport funded. We've got some street equipment that's necessary to help keep up with the needs of the street system that we have, and then of course some water operation. I should note as well, there's certainly some equipment, tools that are necessary, and PPE for the fire department. And one of the things that is also in this budget is moving into phase 3 of the ALPR trailers. I'm sorry, the ALPRs. The ALPRs are the automatic license plate readers, and these would be intended to supplement the system that you've already awarded that's actually underway. They haven't yet been installed, but we've got about 9 or 10 intersections being outfitted. It's under plan. We've awarded the contract, and they're actually starting to do the ordering of the equipment, and expecting that the construction should start for the phase 1 and phase 2 of the ALPRs in June. This budget would take us to finishing out some of those improvements. Then moving on to page 34, and this is where we talk a little bit about what you'll likely see carrying over into the table of org. The table of org is the actual component in the budget document, but from a staffing perspective, what you'll see in the aggregate is for this upcoming fiscal year, the total employee count, direct employees, not including the sheriff, employees under the sheriff contract. You'll actually see a slight reduction in the employee count from a current fiscal year to next fiscal year, a reduction by 3. And you effectively see 1 increase in admin services and a reduction of 4 in the public works, and that's what we're proposing to be. Page 35, it gives you a little bit more of a breakdown of what's actually going to be happening in the table of org. And despite the position reduction, we do have to recognize some changes. In many cases, there's changes in duties, changes in responsibilities. In some cases, there's inequities found where we see certain positions that are same title, such as supervisor, where they're actually on the table of org in different ranges. So there's some inequity corrections in this. In the admin services, while you see position deletion at the finance manager, it's actually a reclass to a finance analyst position. One thing I will note, and you'll see it on the next page, is that effective June 1st, I've initiated a complete reorg of the city, and as a part of that reorg, it's going to rely on a director of finance position, and you'll actually see it offset by, later down the page, a deletion in the director of community services page. Not to say that the director of community services, director of finance, we're actually actively recruiting for that director of finance position, from marketing to actually recruiting and interviewing and then selecting. But you'll see some slight reclass changes due to retirements in the city manager's department. You'll see an equity change in the case of the PIO. You actually see some range changes affecting a few of the leadership titles, Human Resources Officer, the Public Information Officer, and the Code Enforcement Officer. For some reason, we're on the table of org at levels slightly different than the rest of the leadership, so we're effectively trying to correct some of those inequities that exist at. And so with that, I think that kind of captures what our intent is to do. So in the overall, the position reduction is going to be reduction of 3 and correcting a number of classifications. On page 36 of the presentation, what I did want to share with you is some focus that we've had for the last few weeks now, and really stemmed from trying to figure out how we're going to continue to exist, survive with George. Master is working for another community, I'll say. Actually, we wish George the best of luck in his career. New community, but from that announcement, it really put us in a mad scramble to try to figure out how we're going to operate, and it actually gave us a good chance to take a very close look at the organizational structure. And one of the challenges that I've had that I think we have an opportunity to correct now is actually really focus on span of control. And in this particular structure, we focused on, and this structure still relies on a 2 deputy manager system. I actually think at a point in time, because this organization is big, there's a lot of responsibility that goes with it. It's almost hard to manage even with a 2 deputy city manager system. Very efficient though with the staffing resources that we have. But what we have done was we really looked closely at all of the departments. Over the years, there are some unexplainables as to why certain functions are in certain departments. And so we took this as an opportunity to look very closely at the skills that we have. And it does identify that our replacement deputy city manager is Janelle Davidson, effective June 1st. This will be the org chart that goes into the budget, but allowed us to really tap into the talents that we have at the executive and at the leadership levels, and really start retooling and moving functions around to be managed and supervised by the right places in divisions or in departments that had like type operations, to try to encourage greater efficiency amongst the employees, perhaps in the additional utilization for similarly natured jobs that likely doesn't occur when you have the silo effect of one division being in a completely different department. So we've done a lot of realignment throughout this, and I think the biggest point to take away from here, without going into too much detail, is that this actually gives us a span of control of 6. Starting with the deputy city managers, it has leadership reporting to each deputy city manager, where they have 6 direct reports. On each side of the house, you'll see that with 6 direct reports, and you'll actually see 6 direct reports to me, being two of which being the deputy city managers. I'll continue to oversee the VMIS electric and gas operations, work very closely with the public information officer. That will be a direct report of mine, along with the city clerk, and I'll continue to be the point, us and our police department.
Fire department, am I not seeing it, or?
Fire department is on the left side of the presentation. So among Sophie's new reports will be the airport. She actually fire department, risk finance were so that's one of those where water conservation current one of the things, despite the COVID challenges and the uncertainties that we have going into this budget year, and we as the executive and leadership team have taken upon ourselves to closely monitor, and Dr. Reeder, I'm on page 38 now. We've taken the opportunity to monitor we will take the opportunity to monitor much more closely during the fiscal year. So if we learn additional information, say in the first quarter of this fiscal year, say around September, October timeframe, we're not going to be shy about coming back to this council, maybe less than traditional to where we would wait till a mid-year budget. If we see things positive or negative changing, we're not going to be shy about bringing that back to you earlier. So to the extent we have to make some adjustments sooner than typically a mid-year, we will do that. But notwithstanding that, we certainly see opportunity going into the future year despite the uncertainty, and there's still quite a bit of economic development occurring. One of our focuses during COVID, and while we're under the state of emergency, construction was still happening, and we had to really alter the way we did business when it came to inspections, and we made sure that the inspections still happened. It was a little bit more difficult, a little bit slower, because, for example, if we needed to do an inspection to final a home, we had to make sure that, of course, our inspector was able to go to the house, be fully PPE'd up, not have anybody else around. We actually used video cameras on our phones to actually communicate with the supervisor of that site that might be standing on the street outside the building. Bottom line, we made it work, and so we were able to keep COVID crisis to where we were able to still get inspections done. We still accommodated the building. We didn't see a shutdown there, and so with that, we're still seeing activity moving forward that we're going to actually now realize the benefits of in the upcoming fiscal year. So a couple of notables: Chick-fil-A is still moving forward. We've still had activity on that, and that's an example. Those that really like chicken, they're going to be knocking down the old Marie Callender's building on Mariposa Road. We have a new coffee operation taking place on Bear Valley Road, Dutch Brothers, right next to Incredible. A project that's been in the works for quite some time, and it looks like it's moving forward again. CarMax, they're currently navigating through the entitlements for a new dealership on Civic Drive. Page 39 of the presentation shows that we actually have some hotel activity occurring. Anticipated is an Avid Hotel, 87 rooms on Mariposa and Cottonwood. Holiday Inn Express is moving forward. That's another 87 rooms on hotel on Mariposa. And I think the important thing there is when you see hotels happening, from a revenue perspective, I see them as TOT, which is a general funding source. Right now it's about $1.2, $1.3 non-adjusted for COVID, of course. But each time we can get more hotels being built, we see that as a reflection that demand for hotel space is picking up, which also sends a signal that we can have some sense of increase in TOT revenue that benefits the general fund. New restaurant at the Old Green Tree Inn. Forward look on budget operations for the airport, and we talked about how strong they were in terms of revenues and expenditures, but this is a little bit of better detail as to why, and certainly you're seeing new leases with ComAv, Duval Rubber Manufacturing. We've got new parking with ComAv, and that's about 200 additional parking for aircraft that includes Southwest Airlines, Delta, and Boeing. Interestingly, during the early part of COVID, Boeing didn't stop manufacturing airplanes, and as they didn't stop manufacturing airplanes, they needed places to park them because nobody was able to take them. Nobody was flying. So a lot of those planes are actually at our airport right now, and it's inside that 200 number that is referenced for ComAv. We've got a 90% occupancy rate during the fiscal year. We're actually envisioning that we may be fully occupied based upon the lease. That's 100% occupied of leasable facilities. There's still certainly a lot of facilities out there that are eventually tear downs and not occupiable, but of the leasable facilities. Page 41 of the presentation speaks to more budget opportunities. Boeing just re-upped for another 66-month lease. Off airport, United Furnitures is a good sign because they operate in a 500,000 square foot facility. That's a manufacturing operation that is now back up and operating after getting into phase 2 of the governor's orders to reopen. And still moving forward, which we're hoping breaks ground in this fiscal year, is the 975,000 building proposed by Sterling in partnership with Prologis on 45 acres. So, with the opportunities, we can't ignore the challenges. Certainly, we've got the uncertainties dealing with COVID, and I think we've talked about that. There's going to be an impact to the. There's definitely some deferred maintenance that will eventually have to be attended to. Don't know necessarily how slow the growth. Revenue growth is going to be, how long it's going to take to recover, and then I think the biggest challenge that, quite honestly, we're up against, and we touched on it at last week's meeting where we had the public safety plan presented to the council with the recommendation that we start talking about giving an opportunity to the voters to decide to what levels they want to fund public safety. And one of the things that we illustrated in that presentation when we did the cash flow modeling, looking forward 6 and 7 years, pre-COVID, we were looking as if we wanted to maintain service levels, we had healthy reserves, and we really didn't start deficit spending until the 22 fiscal. This COVID pandemic has accelerated the deficit spend to where you're actually seeing it now in this fiscal year, and there's no recovery. We're going to continue to see deficit spends going forward in future years unless something dramatically happens to the positive on the revenue side in terms of sales growth. It accelerates, is our conclusion in that public safety plan, it accelerates the need for this council to seriously consider one of two things. Either revenue enhancement or service reduction, and otherwise we're gonna be deficit spending to the point where we eventually run out of our general. One of our challenges is going forward is trying to identify, which I think we've identified, but also moving forward and getting that necessary revenue support to maintain our existing levels. But if we have any semblance of change, on to those that we hear coming to this council chambers quite regularly complaining about not enough police service, not enough code enforcement service, some revenue enhancement and change our operating posture to be more proactive than reactive. So on page 43, and this brings us to the conclusion of the presentation, certainly the leadership team is standing by to answer any more detailed questions you might have, drawing from this high-level presentation that we shared with you. And then with that, after questions, our next step then would be to present, first take your comments and your feedback, and then present at June 16th that meeting for an actual consideration to adopt the fiscal budget. So with that, I would turn it over to you, Madam Mayor, for any questions or comments of staff.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. so much to absorb. My poor little brain is trying. But it was beautiful. Thank you. A lot of information. At this time, I will ask council members if they have questions. Instead of the 3 minutes, I will give you 5 minutes. I will start with Council Member Cox.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. I have a lot of questions, and I'm not going to ask them because I need to go back to page 1 because I have questions on virtually every page through the whole presentation. And that's going to take about 20 minutes, and I don't have 20 minutes, and so I don't need to start, so I'll send you a memo and copy the council. I don't know how else to do it. I have a lot of questions. And I'll give you, for example, we have transportation tax, the transient occupancy tax. The council doesn't have a policy, as far as I know, where that should be expended. We've been asking in the past that we earmark that specifically for police and fire, since that seems to be the services that are mostly demanded for that. We also don't have a specific policy in regard to the franchise taxes that kind of go to streets, but there's a whole lot of things in the streets, including curbs, gutters, sidewalks, street lights, drainage, and that isn't earmarked specifically, so it goes into the general fund. And I have felt that we're probably down to the point where it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a lot of revenue that's thrown into the general fund, and then we end up with things like capital for upteen millions, but we don't have a list of specific capital projects. Each and every one of us have requests from constituency on what streets need to be improved, and curbs and gutters and drainage. We have, for example, a state agency that's saying we want this waste to whatever you call it, where you have the wells and you pump them. And yet, I got a call today, so I went down and watched some fire hydrants being pumped on the street, but the wells can't be pumped on the street. Doesn't make any sense. I'd like to see the letter from Lahontan demanding that we do that. That'll amount to hundreds, if not millions of dollars in the future. And unless they want to provide the funding, I'm not so sure that's very wise to start doing that. We're spending a lot of funds to do that, just in case we have a well that we need to repair, to have a pump to waste, which is an underground tank. But then we go right next door and open up fire hydrants and flush them on the street. And then the minute, because they don't want sand to go into the Mojave River, but the minute it rains, hundreds of thousands of tons of sand go into the Mojave River. I think that's insufficient. I think this council ought to deal with that, with policy matters. Because it may be that can be expended on better items. So, do you have questions? Almost every slide I have questions, but I'll just write the memorandum and copy the council. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Jones?
Well, I'm kind of tempted to do that myself, although I really would have liked to have listened to your questions, but because I would suppose, Councilmember Cox, that a lot of your questions, or my questions, would be answered in yours. So I'm going to ask just some very, very basic questions. One of the things that did come up in my mind was definitely a list of capital improvement projects and making sure that we're on the right path to getting things done. I remember a few years ago that there was some talk about the roads being done on Bear Valley Road west of Stater Brothers, and I still haven't seen any action on that. And I know that a few years ago there were a lot of people coming to this council meeting expressing concern about it being a washboard and damaging their cars. So I haven't heard any more since that, and at that time I had heard that it was on the list to be done the following year, and yet here we are and nothing's been done on that. So anyway, just a couple very general questions, just for my own learning, because I don't know. How long does it take for the city to get its 1% share of sales tax from the point that the sale originated? Do we know generally?
Yes, Madam Mayor, Council, I can answer that. We actually receive receipts from the state as distributions of sales tax on a monthly basis. And so from the time that, and the businesses will file those returns quarterly. And so it takes, I think, about a good month and a half so after they file their returns. Send us those disbursements. In the interim months, the state sends advances in anticipation of those actual quarterly returns or quarterly filings to us, and we do a payment at the quarter when they actually file, and file quarterly. We get a quarterly payment, and then they're in a month.
So at what point then are we going to really start feeling the effects of COVID in terms of the sales tax?
So the quarterly filings for the April, May, and June are due.
Okay.
Well, at that point, we'll have a really, really good idea of how it performed, and any effects you'll see would be on payment that's received in July.
Okay, very good. And then, and I apologize because I didn't write down what slide number, but I noticed, I think there was, it said 81 at the bottom, but I know it wasn't, I know it was well before slide 25. And it was the slide that, that showed citywide expenditures at 217.5 million. But on the amended budget, it was at 247.3 million. That's about a $30 million difference. Why the tremendous increase?
A part of what you experience between the time that the budget is adopted in June,
That's it.
there are, let me just pull up that slide. There are a variety of different adjustments that are taken to council, but the biggest adjustment is what we define as our carry forward budget. And so any projects, any actual capital project, and it's primarily capital projects, any capital projects that were in progress during the prior year that were not completed and actually funded in the prior year are then carried over in the form of a budget adjustment into the next year.
Because that's where the expenditure took place.
Yeah, so the
Gotcha.
expenditures are actually going to take place in that subsequent year, so we move the budget with it. So that would make up the bulk of that.
Madam Mayor, Brian Gangler is on the line, and if you'd like an answer to that question about Amethyst, I am familiar with that being a need. I know we put it on the list of priorities. I'm not sure where exactly it's at in the pecking order, but if I might, can I call on Brian Gangler to jump in and address the prioritization of Amethyst Road? I'm sorry, Bear Valley Road from Amethyst to 395.
You're on.
I'm sorry, this is Brian Gingler. I had trouble understanding the question.
Brian, the question is the road improvement project improving Bear Valley Road from the stretch of Amethyst to 395. I know we've done a lot of maintenance out there, and I think Doug Matthews is aware of that. I know we've done a lot of crack sealing out there to try to keep that road together. But can you share with us the plan for that improvement? When's it going to occur?
We did a cash flow analysis of our Measure I funds, and that project is not proposed to occur in this coming fiscal year. We have carryover projects to rehabilitate the pavement on Industrial Boulevard and also on Silica Road between Industrial and Hesperia Road. Those projects are coming first. We also just awarded a contract on rehabilitating 3rd Avenue, and so that project is going to be starting soon. And so there are constraints in our Measure I revenue. The revenue estimate was originally about $5 million for the whole year, that revenue estimate has been reduced by, to 4.3 million. So there's definitely a cash constraint on what's available for roads. Some of that goes to, road maintenance. Not all of it goes to capital projects. So the, Bear Valley Road project, I believe was, in the year coming after that. I have not prepared the Measure I 5-year plan yet. That will need to be prepared and submitted to SBCTA, and that actually programs out the Measure I funds for the next 5 years.
Okay, and just a general question, if I could. So if we let's, for example, we have our list of capital improvement projects. We have our list of roads that need to be maintained, and in what order those repairs and so forth are going to occur. If that gets changed, how is the council then informed that, for example, on the capital improvement projects, how is the council informed that there's been a change in what was originally reported to them as going to happen?
I'm having trouble understanding the question because there is an echo, and
Okay.
someone may need to repeat it. Sorry.
Okay, so is this any better, Brian?
Would it be better if I came into the council chambers?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I will do that.
I think we actually had the same echo at the last meeting with my microphone.
There has been a conversation about that Circle Road, and we're monitoring it. It's still a private road. We believe affecting the title out there. There may be eventual property tax sale to where it could eventually come up for property tax sale, but it's still in status of being privately owned.
Thank you for coming in, Brian. So I don't know if I'm going to phrase this question just right, but just going back to the example that I gave earlier about Bear Valley Road, and having been sitting in the audience at the time, and there were a number of audience members that would come up and talk about the state of Bear Valley Road west of Amethyst, that it was like a washboard. And I remember hearing a presentation at the time or a statement at the time that was due for work. I don't know if it was maintenance or it was on a list of projects to be done, but that it was to be done the following year, and this is years later, and it's not done, and now it sounds like that work is further down the pike. So how is the council informed when you have a list that is changing, maybe because of cash flow? Because we're representing to our constituency when work is going to be done, and then when it's not done, we're going to get the flat for it. And we don't know how to answer those questions.
So that would actually be in the 5-year Measure I plan. It has the projects programmed out for the next 5 years. Several years ago, we had taken a priority list of roads to our city council, but I can't remember how far back. It may have been 3 or 4 years ago. But it has to be evaluated every year because sometimes projects change in priority. One example is 3rd Avenue was advanced forward. It was becoming more of a maintenance issue and a concern. And so that project actually was moved forward earlier in time. So sometimes the reprioritization may happen due to an issue like that.
Is there some way without it becoming a tedious effort where if the council is apprised of something a certain way, and then there's some change for whatever reason, that we at least have access to that information, because it does affect how we deal with our community.
Yeah, in the example of Third Avenue, that was in the approved budget for this year. A good,
But it isn't, but I recognize that, but if someone doesn't point out that this went from a priority here to farther down on the list, we might not catch it. And that might make a big difference to our community.
I think the 5-year Measure I plan is probably the best document to refer to as far as the projects that are programmed out in the future.
Does it, and I apologize for belaboring this, does it show what the plan was and how it's been changed? Or does it just show what's going to be?
You would need to look at the
Right.
plan before and compare the two
Right.
plans.
Okay.
We could point out the changes, if that'd be helpful.
If the council is inclined on that, it would be helpful. I think I'm going to leave it at that, because I have a feeling that Councilmember Cox's questions, I'm going to have all of mine answered within his. So that's all I have for now, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Yes. I'm going to spin it a little different, because I know we have audience members that are new here, and a lot of the time we speak as if we know everything, and I'm going to let you know firsthand. We had a presentation that lasted about an hour and 40 minutes. Went way over my head, and it's not because I'm uneducated. I'm going to tell you I'm working on my doctorate degree, so has nothing to do with that. A lot of the time, one of us or many of us feel excluded with the participation, and workshops are supposed to, in my understanding, bring us closer to how we can be more participatory. However, in my tenure here for the 4th year being elected, I've realized that the decision makers are not the council. It's really the people who have been here 20 and 30 years, who have been hired by management, and they're the ones that ultimately make the recommendations and are there toe-to-toe knowing exactly what's happening. So we're just over here kind of like trying to figure it out on our own as well, and it makes it very difficult when we're limited to probably 3, or we have an extra 2 minutes for a presentation that took over an hour and a half. So don't be thinking that we know it all, because we don't. So as many of them are going to be supplying the information for questions, so have I. There is a way that we can be more conversational. It was more unilateral. It wasn't even bilateral, where we could ask the questions, because they could be lengthy. But at the same time, the power of the chair is to extend and make it a conversation. But sometimes individuals can be unwielding the information, and maybe you get to know too much of it and be too participatory. That's just my personal perspective. So it makes it very tough for trying to be more inclusive and engaging, not only to the general populace, but to teenagers such as yourself, 16, 17 high schoolers. And so I'm using my comments real careful here. And that's, as an authority figure up here, I want you to understand that a lot of us are going through, we don't know. We're trying to understand these figures. There's 81 different budgets. It's almost difficult to understand how we can have discretionary over general fund budgets, which is for police and fire, and 62% of it takes up this amount, but then you have all these other funds. And so in the past, I've asked to have workshops for the general public and for ourselves if we wanted to be a part of it. And at one point it was a yes, but for whatever reason, maybe staff cut back or whatever, it didn't go through. So a couple of my things for feedback is, to implement workshops for the general public. The general public would like to be a part of this budget. Sometimes they probably don't know how to. They don't have the technical jargon. A lot of these terminologies like unencumbered and so forth, financing, can go over a lot of our heads, and we don't have even the glossary to go back and look at these pages. So it makes it uncumbersome as well. So I know we have the June 16 meeting, and we're going to have a public hearing. I just feel like perhaps it's a hearing to include you more, but I'm going to tell you that being here for 4 years, I don't feel very included myself. I still feel like I'm trying to understand how to fit in with a class of categorical people that have been here for a very long time, and perhaps with their experience. I'm coming in not too much experience with the business world. Mine is more the educational world. So I'm very different when it comes to that. Lastly, that what I would like to let the public know is truly we have different perspectives, but we want to include you. We just use a different narrative. So hopefully from now on, you know, slowly as the tides turn and the elections come in and replace and place people here, we will begin to understand that as you sit over there, you might think that we have it all and we have the access. It just doesn't work that way. You'll quickly realize that you have to learn on your own. And the way you're learning right now is the way that a lot of us have to take in the information.
You
We're
have 30
voting
seconds.
for this information. So when it comes to the storm drains, the special revenues, the street lighting, local transportation, the Measure I's, DIF, LMADs, DFADs, and all of this in itself, it's so much, but that, believe me, an hour and a half will never be suffice for someone who's coming in to fill in shoes to help you try to make the best of your money to really give out the best interest of yourself and not myself or a group. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Ramirez? Do you have any questions?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, you have 5 minutes.
Is it my turn now?
It sure is. You have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much. I first would like to say thank you for everyone participating and giving us so much information. Sometimes it's wonderful to know all this, but sometimes that also creates a problem. My concern is the impact of the virus on the city of Victorville. And as I was listening, we have a deficit of 1.5% drop. And I would like to ask George, how much money is that actual deficit? Not by percentage, by actual dollars. So George, can you tell me how much money are we short because of the impact of the virus?
Yes, Madam Mayor, City Council, if I may go ahead and answer that question.
Can you speak a little louder, please?
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Is that better?
I didn't hear an answer. Did you give me an answer? Oh, okay.
Pro Tem Ramirez, can you hear me now? Hear me now?
Rita, can you hear
A
me?
little. You're a little better, but not very loud. You're
Okay,
clear, but
I'll
not loud.
talk a little closer to the microphone. But in essence, the major impact from COVID on the general fund revenues, particularly, is about a 15% reduction in our sales tax. And what's going to be experienced in the current year, not necessarily next year, is about a $3.1 million loss in sales tax compared to what we expected when the council approved the mid-year budget amendment. And so in real dollars, like you requested, the current year is going to be at about 3.1 million, and going into next year is predicted another 1.5.
Well, the reason I asked that question, George, was that on the first page when it says revenues and the total is $224.8 million, the expenditures turns out to be $229.5 million. So we're starting with a budget that's going to be already in the red, almost $5 million. And I'm wondering and concerned because of the fact that the expenditures that we spend, even in the new budget, is personnel and operation and maintenance. So when we start looking at the fact of our employees and we start already in the red, my concern is, do you think we can make it up? Now, you say recovery is, would be possible, hopefully, by the first quarter, which is, July and August. So, I'm guessing that we have enough reserves to carry us into the new budget. Hopefully, our debt won't drag us down, and that we won't have to either furlough or lay off anyone, because we're starting with a budget that's almost $5 million short. And when I say that, I'm concerned because looking at expenditures, I see that administration has a 15% change in the budget. The administrative services is 11%, and when you total the amount for 2021, administration is going to be spending $13 million in terms of expenditures. And I'm looking at the fact that if we're going to have to make up a deficit and start with a budget that's already in the deficit, short $5 million, are we going to start looking at being a little more fiscally stable and sound in terms of our expenditures? Because I certainly wouldn't want the city to be in the red. And just so that people say, you know, well, don't start with my job. Well, the best place to start is at the top and work down, okay? So if we're going to cut, let's look at what services we have to. So I'm concerned over the money. And as I went through the budget and I earmarked things that caught my eye, then it came to my memory that we have been talking about public safety plan. And if everybody remembers, I did not vote for it, and I did not vote no, and I said it should be tabled. And the reason why was because it meant hiring 52 additional employees. And that, I said, should not do until we have the money. Well, I looked at the budget for next year in regards to that, and my question to our city manager and to George as well is, in the new budget, have you already included the possibility of hiring those 52 people? Because 30 of them belong to the police. The rest are, I think code enforcement was 6. The fire department might have been 9. And there was one more, code enforcement, animal control, I think was also 6. But it totals up to 52 new employees. And looking at the budget,
You have 30 seconds.
I'm wondering, have you included this possibility that we might approve it and that we will hire 52? Is it already included for the budget of 2021?
I could answer that real quick, and Keith would like to probably add on to that, because I think we're mixing presentations a bit. The presentation
Excuse me, I don't hear an answer.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
No, I cannot hear you. My question is, have you already included it in the 2021 budget if we approve the public safety plan that was put forth in the last city council meeting? Okay. Now, I remember that we took the golf course and we put it under parks. And I'm wondering how much money has the golf
Your time
course
is up.
actually brought in, because in the budget it shows for this next year that it's less than what it was this year. So, yes, I'm over my time. Okay, can I just mention two things that I would like to just to say? I did not see in projects the library nor downtown, and I would like an answer to that.
Well,
you know, sometime, some other time, but that's it. Those are questions that I'm concerned about. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I will.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor and members of the council, Rita, can you hear me? This is Keith Metzler. Rita, can you hear me?
No, you're muffled. You're in an echo. But I will write my questions down to let me say, to keep our city not in the red. I'm for the public safety plan, but not if we don't have the money. That's what I'm concerned about. So thank you for the opportunity. Nice. thank you for your clarification. It does make me feel better, that, you know, we're trying to do the very, very best to I didn't pay your bills, I mean, my concern. And so I thank you for the clarification.
Thank you, Rita. But if you have anything else you wanna put in? Okay, I did have a question on capital improvements, the difference in dollars, but that one was answered already. I also have a question on lighting, but I will put it in writing and submit it. Bear Valley Road and 395, I did have questions on that, but now I see that it is a part of the 5-year plan, so somehow that answered my question. And it will also be addressed, I believe, when Mr. Gangler you an answer. Is that correct, Ms. Jones? Was he supposed to address that to you?
I think he, thank you for asking. I think he pretty much did. I think it just sounds like it's incumbent upon us to compare the changing 5-year plans to see what project might have changed in priority.
The only thing is that we don't know
Right.
what happens.
Correct.
We just know that it's part of the 5-year plan.
Correct.
But it would be easier, or we would appreciate knowing when the changes.
And what I will do as staff is I will look into prioritizations. I understand how the priorities are made, but I'll look into specifically how do we call attention to any of it, how we're highlighting with the council.
Yeah, and just an update on it for us so that we understand the reasons behind it. Thank you. There's no motion or second. This was just at the discretion of the council, so it was just a presentation. Is that correct?
Madam Mayor, I do have a question, comment if I could. Thank you, staff, for the presentation. I want to clarify something. Nowhere in
Excuse
this
me, Jim.
I'm sorry.
Madam Clerk, we still have additional 5 minutes for each one, correct?
If, at the public comments, if you choose to do that, yes. I mean, at the, not public comments, I'm sorry, council member comments.
Have additional 5 minutes for each one.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to point out that nowhere in the presentation did I hear the words furlough or layoff. Nowhere. That came somewhere out of left field that has nothing to do with this proposal. I want before it hits the newspaper, it's contemplated. It is not contemplated. Secondly, we don't have a budget in the red. It is illegal for the city council to adopt a budget in the red. They simply has to cut something. So I want to clarify some things get said and have taken out of context, leave the wrong connotation. So on property taxes, I have paid my property tax bills, and every one of them were more than the property taxes last year. And the information that I have seen is property tax income is expected to be up this year, but down next year. You won't know until we get into November of next year whether that's true or not. So we have a long time. Same way with sales tax. We know it's going to be down. But if there's any fear of any kind about adopting a budget in the red, we're not allowed to. Very simple. You use the reserves, you cut expenditures, but we're not allowed to. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, Member Cox, because if we look at that slide, Dr. Ramirez was referring to the 4-point-some odd million in the unencumbered fund balance. Right, there, back one. It's the unencumbered fund balance of $4.7 million. So I'm wondering if it would be helpful to explain that further, because that gives the appearance that we're in the red, and so maybe it would help if we clarified. I think that we had the same discussion last year during the budget, but it might be helpful to bring it to the fore again.
Yes, I can do that. Madam Mayor, members of the council, that's page number
If you don't mind, would you come back here where everyone can hear
yes.
you really plainly so that there's no questions after you give your presentation? I'm sorry to interrupt, but communication's problem.
Did I surprise you? Yes, of course I did understand.
Thank you, Mr. Metzler, I appreciate it. That's all I have, Madam Mayor.
Okay, Ms. Gomez?
Thing briefly that I had. So the budget is a very important document that we have discussed today. It's in order to create a plan, but clearly the plan has already been preset, and then we're just kind of like extending or doing incrementalism, which is adding and looking at different deficits if there is, as it was explained right now. Really, what we're doing or hoping to do is to ensure that we have enough things that are potentially needed so our community hopefully comes first for whatever is important. I say this with an emphasis because community involvement is very, very important. If you take maybe just 5 seconds to look around this room, you will begin to see how many people from the actual public are here. You may not know, but a lot of us here have to be here because we're either elected or we appointed people. So you might find one or maybe two of you are here. That speaks a lot about the decision-making process of what's in this room right now. About 125,000 people versus a couple here that were either elected or appointed. Please consider that when you look and you come into this room. It's very important. So a lot of us are either staff, like I said, or we have to be here, or we get paid to be here, or else probably wouldn't be here. With that in consideration, remember that if you're the sole person that's here, you are so valuable because you don't know the difference that you have in the power of making that change. You have a lot of following. Make sure to use it and make a change, because once we're here and we're status quo, we don't see anything outside of the realm of here. We fail to see other people's perspective, and it's so important. Muy importante que si tú estás aquí, pongas mucha atención, el cuarto alrededor, quién está y quién no está. Mi interés es muy diferente al tuyo y al de ella, y al de aquel señor y el de aquí. El dinero es el que hace al perro bailar. Fíjate cuánto ganamos y cuánto aportamos a este lugar. Y cuando oyes esas vocecitas, ponte a pensar quién está a tu lado, si es que te quieren apoyar. Muchas gracias.
Mayor Pro Tem Ramirez, you have 5 minutes. All right, thank you. I also don't have anything else to add on to this. I think everything else has been discussed, and my additional questions will be put in writing and submitted. Or do we have something else, maybe?
Mayor, our intent solely tonight was to give you a preview hard work that the staff had put into and actually drafting a budget for you. Certainly we wanted to hear, well, let me first say, we draft these budgets based upon our view of the council, what we've heard from the council, and then of course we make recommendations to you as the council, which is our role. And tonight is about trying to get your feedback as to anything we'd like to see differently about how we would present a final budget for your approval June 18th. Maybe just drawing comparison to last year to this year, we're in slightly different position, because I think this time last year we actually identified a meaningful amount of money that we called discretionary, because we actually had started this fiscal year believing it was going to be a good fiscal year, so we actually established a discretionary amount for the council to literally pick and choose what it thought it wanted to take on as additional discretionary project. Different this year, of course, because of the environment that we're in with COVID, but had we not been in COVID, I do believe we'd be in a similar, we're able to recommend you a budget that we responsible to properly run those 81 funds, but then also identify for you anything that's discretionary that we council to take on additional public service. Not there today. We're hoping, of course, that things get better, and if things do get better, then obviously staff would come back to you and share some of those perspectives with you, so that you can make decisions about how to spend some of those discretionary funds. But our role really here is to present this to you based upon our professional recognition and responsibilities to each fund. Ultimately, you're the policy decision makers. Back to you. Try not to make too many tweaks. Of course, if we, from the questions and comments, we have to adjust based upon the feedback that we get from you, we'll certainly do that as a part of what we present on.
One thing I will add, I do have a concern with the sales tax portion of the revenue, because since I deal with this through my business, I know a lot of the small businesses did not even file their sales tax reports because they were given till July the 15th. However, they have already gone out of business, and they are not going to be paying their sales tax. So that's another, and I'm sure you have already considered that. But just for information, there's a lot of small businesses that are not there anymore, and they are not going to pay. That was for the first quarter of the year. So, anyhow, sad news, but that's the way it is right now. Okay, I believe we don't have anything else before this council, so we will adjourn this